me at the moment, but we have a wonderful lunchtime presentation, a fireside talk between Charles Wilkinson and Rebecca Tsosie, two of the scholars and also advocates in this field who've inspired so many of us to take what is the title of this panel, Inspired Action in Indian Country. And we realize that this conference, or we hope that this conference is a little bit different than most, in that it's not just about reflection or intellectual engagement, but getting out there and doing something over the short and long term. And Charles Wilkinson, in his work with tribes, which is extensive, as well as his writings, his incredible volume of scholarship, has studied different moments and social movements in Indian country, especially around the end of termination and the rise of self-determination in the United States. And to kind of inspire us and remind us of the tribal leaders and lawyers and others who've picked up this kind of challenge in the past, we asked Charles to share some highlights from his experiences over the years, both his own engagement and his writing. Rebecca Tsosie, and I should say Charles is my colleague here at the University of Colorado. Most of you know him. He has, as I said, a huge body of scholarship. He is a university distinguished professor here and has every single award and accolade you can possibly imagine. And I would take up all the time if I tried to describe them, so go on the website and check them out. Rebecca Tsosie is an equally distinguished colleague and a very powerful voice, scholarly and in terms of engagement. She was doing international human rights law before it was cool, early in her career with some tenacity and fearlessness that perhaps wasn't always readily accepted by the Academy, but she did it anyway. And she and Charles have often worked together with tribes. And I've asked her, after Charles gives some historical remarks, to think about inspired activism in Indian country now and going forward, to connect those historical movements with the current movement, the current social movement, and opportunities for change in the future. And they've asked me to share with you that this will not be a conventional panel presentation. It is, and you can see by the way they're sitting, a bit more of a chat kind of session, although Charles will start and Rebecca will follow. If we have time for Q&A, great. If we don't, you can surely catch them later in the day. Again, greetings and thanks to our friends who are joining us out there in cyberspace, and thank you all, and please welcome Charles and Rebecca.
Thank you, Kristen. And Rebecca, it's great always to have a project with you. I'd like to thank Jim Anaya, who is such a full person and advocate, and we are so lucky to have him. And John Echohawk also. And my thoughts today, I kind of think they may never would have happened if it hadn't have been for the way that John and his careful but insistent way encouraged me to really try to see what individual Indian people felt and worry about and care about. And some of those thoughts are these, with the understanding that we are talking about a movement here, and that so many proposals that come forward, in fact, are movements in Indian country, and the impact of culture and place, land, and how none of this would happen without those individual experiences. Billy Frank was arrested 50 times for exercising his treaty rights to take salmon. Now that's tough, but when you get down under it, it's a whole lot tougher even. Billy was one of just a couple of hundred people, 300, 400, 500 Indian people, fishers, who wouldn't stop in spite of all the arrests. And just time after time after time, they'd get hauled out up from their boats. And often, these were places down near the mouth where there may have been locks put in to help stop erosion. But they were getting dragged over those rocks. And look, what they were doing and feeling was, yes, the current and the air, the wind, but they were feeling too all the old times. This was their home river. It had been home river since time immemorial. And they knew they were doing what all the people before had done. And it gave them such satisfaction. Turn over those nets. Turn over those salmon. Give us that boat. We're going to impound those. Come on, buddy. Take your hands off those nets. Get out of that boat, or I'll get you out of it. That boat was a cedar canoe that took 2 years to make and shape and dry and construct in seats and paddles. The paddles were ornate, and often the boats were ornate. All taken away. All taken away. It was taken away all those years. But they wouldn't quit. And they held out the hope, even though they were being taken into state courts in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that someday the federal courts would come in, and that someday there'd be lawyers, which there weren't back then. They just kept fishing, just kept getting arrested. And one thing I learned was that what gave them particular resolve, I believe, was there were some elders whose grandparents were there at treaty time. And the stories were really strong to them. And they just believed, the elders did, that the Supreme Court would come in and help them at a time when the Supreme Court was helping dispossessed peoples. And of course that happened. And the Bolt decision came down. But ultimately the Bolt decision was because of the culture, the first salmon ceremony, thanking the fish for coming to you, and the place. And it mattered so much that they hung on through all of that. Menominee country is, of course, very different. The Menominee Reservation was 250,000 acres. It's a forest. I don't know how many of you have been there, but you go to the Menominee Forest and you remember it. Tribal member or no. In 1968, Congress passed the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and declared an initial 6 rivers as the premier rivers for wild and scenic. The Wolf River that ran right down through the middle of the Menominee Reservation. And it's the best part of the river, the wildest part of it, was Menominee country. That's what the outside society thought about that river. Well, the Termination Act got passed at Menominee. The land all transferred to a state corporation. And, of course, there's all kinds of detail. But what it came down to is that within another 10 years, the stock in that corporation was going to be open market, and it was going to be taxed. There was a short time period where Congress said this land won't be taxed and it can't be sold. But the Menominees knew that timber companies wanted that land and developers wanted that land. And even during this time after termination, while the land was still in, quote, Menominee hands, it was really being administered by a bank, things started to happen. The bank sold some lands, created a new lake so that second home people could have a home in this fabulous forest. Wild. The forest is wild. I saw my first wolf there. And of course the Menominee people, what you'd hear was that lake covered up that dancing site for our family. That road goes right over a burial area. Another one goes right over clearly a sacred place for us. And many things like that. And that land, if you're Menominee, and it's so easy to see how they would, because anybody feels that land. The Menominee just feel it so much deeper. And so the Menominees wouldn't quit. And by 1970, had this march on Madison, right to the governor's office, who gave them his support. And so at that time came to John and David Getchus at NARF and asked that NARF take on the Menominee restoration. I and Yvonne Knight took it on. And it was a sacred task for us, and of course sacred for the Menominee. And they took us out on the land, and we went to some of those places. Jim White, powerful man, handsome, a great orator. To this day, I can hear Jim White's voice and his ability to inspire people and understand the Menominee cause. And Jim took me out fly fishing a couple of times on some of the tributaries of the Wolf River and showed me his favorite places. And so the bill went in early '72 for the Menominee restoration. And there was a meeting that really was one of the most constructive meetings I've ever been at. And the Menominee, there were some people in Congress who weren't behind it, but the whole Wisconsin delegation, with one exception, was behind it. The White House was behind it. And so, but it was a complicated act, and there were questions like, they're, quote, terminated. How can you undo that? That's final. Does Congress have authority to do it? And many others were involved. And so there were tables out in the middle of the large House interior hearing room. And I'm going to say there were 20 people there and at the table, and probably another 10 or so from agencies, Justice Department, Health, BIA, and the congressional offices, staff, higher staff. And it was, as I say, incredibly productive. I was new at this stuff. I was a young lawyer. I hadn't ever put through a bill before, tried to put through a bill before Congress. But people were earnestly talking through issues. And mostly, or almost always, coming out favorable with Menominee, and just make this little twitch in the bill and it'll be okay. And it was that kind of meeting where it was really kind of satisfying. And so about 5:30, I remember because I looked at my watch just a couple of minutes later, right about 5:30, the fellow from Gaylord Nelson's office, who was chairing the meeting, said, well, we've had a good day. We've had a full day. And let's be glad and get moving and try to get this accomplished. And people started to get set up, and all of a sudden came somehow the loudest sound I've ever heard. And it was Jim White, who had not said a word during the day, who slammed his big hand down on the table, and it was just thwack! The whole room filled up with that noise. And then he said, our land, our land. We've been here for 9 hours, and nobody has mentioned our land. I know all these details have to get taken care of, but this is about our land, our Menominee land. Come up and see the land. You'll see why we care about it. This is Menominee land, and I don't think we should stop now, because we haven't discussed it. A fellow from Gaylord Nelson's office said, looks like we should send out for pizza. And we did. And we did talk about the land. And we ended up with a very complicated but effective, extremely effective way of transferring this land that was being held by a bank back into trust for the Menominee. Bears Ears is a whole different kind of landscape than Pacific Northwest and Upper Great Lakes area. But of course, the ties to the and of course the ties to the land are different in the specifics, but it's just as intense, as you well know. And That's arid country. Bears Ears in southern Utah. And the tribes wanted to come together, 5 tribes, Navajo, Hopi, Northern Ute, Mountain Ute, and Zuni, wanted to come together and did, and formed a coalition. And what I will always remember, one thing I'll always remember from that is the extent of deliberations that the kind of core 150 people of tribal leaders and tribal members, the time they took and what they had to go through to be available to get everything down right, because petitioning the president for a national monument is a big deal, and you've got to do it right. And they knew, and we discussed this a lot, that they all had to know the issues inside out and be satisfied that we were asking for the right thing. And one thing that they knew they wanted, or I can't say that. One thing that was an issue is whether the tribe wanted to ask for co-management, which would be tough to get, and would make this the first monument that had ever happened with. And it was achieved, by the way, but in President Obama's proclamation. But it was complicated. And so right away, at this first organizational meeting where the coalition was formed, they agreed that they would meet a week and a half later on the second Saturday, and discuss only, have a full day-long meeting on on co-management. And then the next every other Saturday would be to go over drafts of the proposal to the president, so that it really would become tribal documents, and tribal members would have all day to discuss collaborative management, all day to discuss draft 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so at that first day, I just was taken back so much. I mean, it started at 8:30, and it started at 8:30, not Indian time, working lunch, finish up at 5:30, have dinner, and then there'd be individual conversations afterwards. But the co-management, first of all, one person, Jim Enote from Zuni, whom some of you may know, felt that co-management was the wrong phrase, and that it was too clinical, and that collaborative management was both warmer and more welcoming, and also is what they wanted. They wanted to work with the federal agencies to be the managers of the park, joint decision making, and it would be collaborative. And people discussed that, and it was very productive, and it was, the tribes from there on called it collaborative management. And then there was the question of traditional knowledge. So we put up a spectrum on the board of co-management, or collaborative management, which are very general terms. And it was from weakest to strong, like that word. But that would be at one end of the spectrum. And then at the far end would be both, it's complete co-management in that both sides have vetoes over any decisions. And we made it clear that probably there are constitutional problems there, and that it might be a delegation to the outside of constitutional bounds. But you could come very close to that. You could have strong collaborative management. And so the discussion went on all day, and we emphasized that this is going to be a lot of work, so that it can be that in a sense is a disadvantage. You're taking on really big responsibilities. All of Indian country is going to be watching you, and so you're going to have to, collaborative management is going to be demanding. And this was kind of typical of the way that decision making went with this group. Discussed all day long, real open, great questions, great responses, a lot of back and forth. And toward the end of the day, around 5 o'clock, somebody said, well, what are we going to do? And there was a silence. And a woman, a tribal council member from Ute Mountain and Ute said, I move we have a strong co-management. Everybody in favor? Every hand went up. And then traditional knowledge, and I have to tell you, in all my time in this wonderful field, boy, that traditional knowledge is something that just grabs me. I didn't know much about it before. I know some things about it now. And by the way, this defining they did, that they finally decided that traditional ecological knowledge, which is sometimes used, is not the right term. Not the right term, because ecology is a Western science. And following up on that, it's a good science. It's useful. We're not saying it's not useful. We're just saying that it's not indigenous. So it's got to be traditional knowledge, not traditional ecological knowledge. And the tribes, it was interesting, over the time to hear them explaining that to people, for example, because they did know a lot. And so you have this wonderful set of possibilities among people in this arid climate who talk so much about seeds and growing and applying water to it in a way that you don't hear in the Northwest or Menominee. And bare root. They talked about, look, some people are going in and taking out too much bare root. There's some commercial value. And so the idea would be that you would take the traditional knowledge about bare root, which is very extensive, how it's used, how you protect it, and what problems can be created that can hurt the bare root crop. And they talked about that with several different kinds of vegetation. It was fascinating. And so the discussion continued to be very deep, and that's an additional subject where it was. And I'll just finish off with something that, because traditional knowledge is another way of knowing, not a better way, but Western science isn't better than it's another way of knowing. And Willie Gray Eyes, Navajo, talked, and he talked in public and he talked at the meetings often about the need for bear's ears to be protected for healing. And he would talk about how we go to bear's ears and we can be healed. And I didn't get that at the beginning. It sounded to me just kind of didn't hit my ear right. But then one time he said, it heals us from all the years. And then somebody said, what do you mean from all the years? And he says, well, from having bear's ears taken from us. from having other lands taken from us, from the wars, from all the discrimination we've held. And what he was talking about, was historical trauma. And we know about PTSD and soldiers. Well, that on the Anglo side, that research got extended to Jewish people who had lost relatives to the Nazis. And then there has started to be some traditional, some analysis of tribes as having PTSD from what has happened to them. And then a lot of people would start saying, yes, I go there, and it just makes me feel so good and safe. And if we can keep it that way, then it really is going to be healing. I feel, other people started saying, yes, I feel healed when I go there. And so the particular movement in the Northwest ended up in the Bolt decision. But the real reason was the fishermen. And at Menominee, it ended up in a federal statute, but the real reason was the people who love that land. And the same is true at Bears Ears. And in case you're interested, we're going to win that lawsuit against this goddamn president for tearing Bears Ears apart.
Oh my God, I can listen to you all day long. I appreciate you so much, Professor Charles Wilkinson. Thank you for the heart that you have. Thank you for giving those gifts of your intellect, your mind, and your heart all those years to all of those Native communities and their allies. Thank you for your leadership on the behalf of all the people in Indian country. I just appreciate you, and I love and respect you so much. Thank you.
And people in this room feel the same thing about you. That's true.
Good afternoon. You are a beautiful audience. Are you happy? Are you well fed? Yes. And we have had so much to think about today. Is anybody feeling that? Like there are just so many thoughts wandering around in your mind and you're not sure if you can even keep it together, because we have 2 more panels this afternoon, so you got to keep it together. So consider me your little segue. Just a humble little segue with a couple of simple observations to take you from a very rich morning, a very rich array of stories and narratives into our afternoon sessions. And just know that there is a certain energy that all of you have, that you encapsulated in your remarks, and that the stage has been set. John Echohawk, your leadership of NARF, for all of these years, your dedication, your amazing attorneys, your amazing staff, and the board members that you have had over the years, some still with us and some not still with us. And I am very fortunate to have been one of them for 6 years.
Yeah.
And I probably had no business, because I was just starting in academia, and the Indian legal program was brand new, and I was the only faculty member. But there's a liberty in that, because you can teach whatever you want, and you can say whatever you want, and nobody is going to smack you. And so it was really the NARF board experience that opened my mind. We had such phenomenal leadership, and it was men and women. Remember Mildred Cleghorn, Catherine Harrison. They sat with me, and I was so amazed at their leadership and what they brought to the table, but the respect that the men and the women had for each other, and the love of culture that ran through it. And that was where I was so inspired by these legacies, by these stories. And for Dean Anaya and the wonderful faculty of CU, so many wonderful colleagues here who are leaders on these issues, Indian law, international human rights law, natural resources law, public lands law, water law, all of that is now bundled together in this partnership, and that is the future. That is the future, because it is an intellectual leadership informed by the communities and the lives and the histories and the legacies that are embedded in the communities on the land. The land and the people are inseparable. And it is these very strange frameworks of legal institutions and educational institutions, and then all the power politics that go on, which I'm continually horrified about. And for the young people that spoke out in the last session after at the Q&A, I applaud you people for speaking out and raising the questions. The worst thing that you can do in an atmosphere like we have now is to just keep silent and say, well, I'm not going to be the squeaky wheel. I won't say that. And that's why, yay for you saying what you just said about we're going to win that lawsuit. Don't shy away from saying things. Money is power in today's world. And there's a spiritual energy in power. And you can use it for great things, as has been done here, or you can use it in very negative ways. And those forces are coming at the public universities big time right now. So in my remarks today, I want to be very respectful. I travel all around the country giving lectures at different universities, and I talk to the faculty, I talk to the students. And so the things that I say today, I don't want them to be inflammatory. I just want you to think about the importance of language, power, and money. So the stories that you just heard are stories of what I would call, in the movement sense, the sovereignty movement. And I was powerfully influenced by Dean Anaya, by Charles Wilkinson, by David Getches, by Bill Rice, who's no longer with us, but he's with me because I hear his voice in his writings. I read his writings, and Judge Bigler is here. These are the powerful, powerful voices of the sovereignty movement that are in this room today. And I don't think that any one of them will ever give up the use of the term sovereignty. Will you?
No.
Because there's a movement afoot right now to discount sovereignty, to question self-determination, to say, don't talk about nation building. We don't want to jeopardize our country's national identity. You can talk about multiculturalism, just don't talk about multinationalism. You can talk about self-governance. I mean, hey, even the HOA is self-governing. But we're not going to give up those terms. And so the movement that we're in process of exploring is the movement of self-determination of peoples with an S. And that is challenged right now. I've been going to more meetings where the policymakers in the international sense are talking about indigenous and local communities. That's not the right language, is it? Self-determination of peoples. So that commitment in the human rights language, I think, is very important. And the people in this room, they know more about that structure. And Dean Anaya's presentation this morning was absolutely phenomenal. But here are the things that I want to draw parallels to, because I think that the Declaration is exceedingly important because it gives language to that Charter of Rights that Indigenous peoples have in their right to self-determination. And when I looked back in the history that the Universal Declaration, in 1948, And I actually pulled it up, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because that was the big Bill of Rights that led to those two treaties, right? The Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. Those were 1966 treaties, but this was 1948. So it took them that long to get to the treaty stage. And question for you guys, I don't know, I want to have Q&A with you, but if I keep talking forever, then that's not going to happen. So I'm going to keep it short. But the question is, are we moving toward that idea that there is a treaty that comes out of the Declaration and that nation states need to defend their will to either sign on to a treaty or not? Because that's what happened with the Universal Declaration. It wasn't enough to just have the prescriptive Bill of Rights. You needed the treaty to actually make it real. That had all of those things in it. Equality, it had all of this stuff in it. But it also had this other section, subsection B, I think it was, after the main text where all human beings are born free and equal, rights to life, liberty, all of that stuff, right? And then there's subsection B that talks about the fate of minorities. Wait a second, they're individual human beings, five-fingered, but they're also minorities in the nation state. And it actually disclaims taking any action on what should be their rights, because it says, you know, it really depends. They could be in any one of these countries. You really have to see the context. And so we're going to send it out for the committees, the subcommittees, the commissions, that whole structure that we have now to deal with minority rights. Well, what was happening in the United States in 1948? Did we have an equal protection clause in the Constitution? I think so. Did we have separate but equal? I think so. Did we have to go through a civil rights movement to desegregate, to get Brown versus Board saying in the context of K through 12 education, you have to have equal educational opportunity, which means you can't formally segregate. Oh, but the schools today, they're more segregated than they were in 1954. So now we're under conditions of formal equality, but we still have the disparity. And that's the challenge of this generation. We may have those provisions in the formal law, but we still lack the substantive equality. So in the world that we live in, there is an illusion of reality that is reflected in formal law. That is an illusion. The substantive right lives somewhere. Where does it live? It lives in the spirit of the people. And that's my second point. When Vine Deloria wrote in his work, and Kristen, you put up the chart about the relationship of people and place, and he wrote about that as basically a metaphysical relationship. It transcends time. It transcends space. And that's why your DNA, your ancestral connection to the land and your past generations and your future generations, that is a spiritual connection. And that can never be severed. It doesn't mean that they're not going to move you off of your lands. They have, and they will continue to try. But you are still part of that land. And anybody who is in the room who's had that experience of going back to a place where you have heard about, but you have not been there until that moment. And there is that quality where you know that that is your place. That's where the knowledge comes from, and that's the power of traditional knowledge. It really is at that level, that metaphysical level, but that is the beautiful thing. When I have talked to traditional healers about their work, they will often say the healing takes place in consciousness first, and then it manifests in your body in form. But it has to take place in consciousness first. And that is what we're engaged in right now. That is the reparative justice for what has happened in the wake of colonialism, where you don't even know who you are, you don't know who anybody else is, you doubt everything, and that's why you take people's money to do something that is meaningful in a material context, but you've lost the rest of that. That is not the world that we want to be in, but it is the legacy of the world that we have been left with. So every single person in this room is engaged in a process of creation, because you know that those substantive rights will emerge, in fact, from the vision that you hold and that you share and that you give language to. And the provisions in the Declaration, and I'll talk about 3 that have been referred to selectively today, but that I see happening right now. Article 31 talks about rights to cultural heritage, including intellectual property. That's the subject of the WIPO negotiations on those treaties for traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions, and genetic resources. Again, those terms are very important, and they're economically being touted as resources. But the last couple of centuries tell us what happens when you term something as a resource. What happens? Commodification, extraction, sale, displacement, dispossession. So the work that NARF and NCAI, informed by our brilliant native scholars, oh my God, like Matthew Fletcher, just keep writing. That's all I have to say to Professor Fletcher. Just keep writing and talking. Okay, so, but that's a powerful partnership. That is happening right now, today, and that language in the Declaration is of pivotal importance in recalibrating from resource to actually what that heritage means in an ancestral world. The second one was referred to today. That's the provision on the, I think it's Article 25, on the spiritual relationship that Indigenous people have with their traditional territories. That is the metaphysical premise. That's going to carry it forward. There's not another group that I'm aware of that has a spiritual relationship to the lands. And then finally, I want to talk about the provision on Native women. And I'm very, very appreciative to Carla Fredericks for her amazing advocacy, heroic work, and also the council delegate, Mr. Brown, who spoke this morning on behalf of the Navajo Nation on the human trafficking issue. Thank you so much for that advocacy, that powerful, powerful advocacy. Native women are mentioned in the Declaration. They're mentioned in Article 22, when it says, particular attention shall be paid to the rights and special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities, and the state shall take measures to control and prevent violence against Native women and children. So it does say that. Why did Indigenous women end up in that lineup? Aren't Indigenous women the people? They're the complementary house, men and women. But in the power structures that we have today, informed by the hierarchies that Professor Fletcher talked about, there is a form of paternalism that operates. And it operates with Indigenous communities just like everybody else. And it infects the institutions when Indigenous women are silenced. So I was at the Eastern Band of Cherokee earlier in the fall, and there was a conference there on Native women and healing, and Goche Cook, the Mohawk clan mother, she was there. I call her Dr. Cook because she's a traditional midwife and she knows more about science and women and midwifing and birth, like seriously, volumes. She even says that your microbiome, they figured this out, the scientists did, comes from your grandmother. I did not know that, you know, so this is important stuff. But anyway, she was talking about how our bodies actually are carrying all those toxins right now, right? The toxins from the energy companies are doing business on tribal lands. So women's bodies are impacted, the future generations are impacted, as well as these phenomena with the energy companies coming on and the man camps and all of this stuff that you know, that we are fighting. But in that, what I want to say is thank you to every single man in this room who is a leader upholding your moms, your grandmas, your sisters, your wives, your daughters, your granddaughters. Thank you for that. Thank you for not silencing us. Thank you for welcoming us into the future, because it is a beautiful future, and that's the only way that life and regeneration occurs. So thank you.
Thank you. You can probably see why we humbly asked Charles and Rebecca to speak about inspired action in Indian country. And if all of the ancestors that they've talked about and the contemporary folks in the struggle can do it, and if they can do it, we can too. We probably don't have time for questions and answers. Hopefully we can just soak in all of this wisdom and beauty that you've shared with us and use it to go out there and make a difference. We will reconvene downstairs for the Comparative Panel, taking into account the experiences of Indigenous peoples in other countries as they're important in their own right, and also as hopefully they will inform the efforts here. So please join me in thanking Charles and Rebecca, and I'll see you downstairs.